And we have with us a bevy of experts representing, as I said, tech providers, civil society watchdogs, and international institutions in the persons of Julia Jasińska, Head of International Relations and Trade Policy at Nokia, Liga Rozentale, Senior Director of EU Governmental Affairs for Cybersecurity Policy and Security of Emerging Technologies at Microsoft, Kerstin Vignard, Head of the Support Team to the General Assembly, processes pursuant to Resolutions 7327 and 73266 UNIDIR, and Eileen Donahoe, Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator, Cyber Policy Center, Stanford University, and Tobias Feakin, Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology from Australia. And the host of this large panel is Przemysław Roguski, lecturer at the Department of Public International Law of the Jagiellonian University.
Okay, let's start, everybody. Hello, and thank you for this kind introduction. It is a great privilege to host this panel with such excellent guests. During the next 70 minutes, we will be discussing a topic of great importance, which is how technology providers, the civil society, and international institutions can ensure that the internet is used in a peaceful way for the present and future benefit of mankind. And now we have all witnessed how cyberspace and the digital economy have transformed our lives. The fact that during a global pandemic, we can gather online at Central Europe's biggest cybersecurity conference is the best proof of that. And we have also seen how malicious use of information and communication technologies can lead to huge financial losses. Think of the WannaCry ransomware attack, endanger international peace and stability, put human rights at risk, and even, sadly, lead to loss of life, as has happened only a couple of days ago in Germany, where a patient in urgent need of an operation had to be transferred to a different hospital because her hospital in Düsseldorf has been hit by a ransomware attack, and she sadly died on the way there. And so the time to act is clearly now, and I'd like to turn to the panelists with the initial question: how can we ensure that the internet, or cyberspace more generally, is used peacefully? And I would like to turn first to Ambassador Feakin, who is Australia's Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and who joins us from Australia, where it is, at least in Canberra, 2 in the morning. So good evening to you, Mr. Ambassador. Many thanks for being with us at such a late hour. And I would give over to you for your initial remarks.
Great, thanks so much for that, and sorry for just being a little bit late on the call there. Yeah, it's 2 a.m. So I would say the normal greeting of g'day from Australia. It's actually good morning, but I'm sure we've got people from around the world here. So fantastic to be here. Look, I'm happy to join this panel and talk a little bit more about how do we go about creating and preserving a peaceful and stable cyberspace. I think it's no secret, really, Australia is very much focused on the idea that this is something that we do in partnership. Yes, okay, it's the state's responsibility to maintain security for its citizens, but we have a shared responsibility between us, governments, industry, civil society. Often you hear that said, and I'm not quite sure how that manifests itself in reality. Perhaps we can dig into that through the process of this panel. I think firstly, I'll say something which might seem controversial at first. Discussions at the UN are important, but they're not the be-all and end-all. And I think sometimes we get so focused on everything that goes on at the UN, and it's an incredibly important and vital process, that we forget there's a whole range of other ways and means that we can sustain and try and reinforce a stable cyberspace. So yes, we'll get into the UN discussion, no doubt, which I know you've already had panels on around the UNGGE, the OEWG, and we have fantastic foundations through the various processes at the UN that we've had over the years, whether it be the 11 norms of state behavior that were agreed in 2015, or the fact that international law applies. We're still very hopeful that we can build upon those principles in the current UN processes, but we need to implement those rules. That's something that we're incredibly focused on. Many countries are already doing this. Something we've been focused on as Australia is very much trying to provide practical ways that countries can implement what seem at times like quite esoteric normative discussions. We tabled a paper at the UN which was around norm implementation and tried to outline all the different ways that our different government departments were going about implementing those particular norms. And I think, there are quite obviously countries that aren't implementing those norms of behavior, but that they fall into two major categories. First of all, there are those who can't, and I think that's where capacity building, this conversation needs to come into play. We work incredibly hard in trying to support a whole range of countries be more involved in the norm discussion, but also in terms of uplifting their cyber capacity in order that they can actually implement some of those norms that are already lifted. But also, there are also those who won't. And I think that leads to the next point. And I think one of the main areas of contention in the discussion, which is that we need to respond when the rules are broken, and those countries that willfully choose to ignore the rules, they don't act with impunity, and that there is some cost. And that's where yes, the UN is important, but we have those agreed laws and norms. We now need to try and ensure that there is some kind of comeback if those rules are broken. In Australia, we've been through a whole sweep of all of our different, if you like, levers that we have inside government to see how we can respond to cyber incidents and use the full suite of national power to ensure that there is some kind of response if the rules are broken. And we can talk a bit about those perhaps in the Q&A, but those can range from diplomatic to economic to legal, law enforcement, military, or even working with the private sector on responses. Obviously, those responses are always lawful, proportionate, and in keeping with our own domestic law and international law. But then we also need to build trust and confidence among states to avoid escalation to conflict. And we see a whole range of confidence building measures that are being championed through various different regional forums, as well as the UN itself. But all of these elements can't be treated in isolation. And really, you'll hear other speakers, I'm sure, talk about this kind of framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. But this is something that we work a great deal on as Australia. And again, recognizing that none of this can be achieved by ourselves, and working with partners, both other states and also private sector, NGOs, academia, in order that we can achieve a more stable cyberspace is absolutely the right way forward. So we place partnerships at the heart of everything we do in Australia, and I think you can see evidence of the importance of doing so. I'll tie up my kind of opening comments there, and really happy to get into a bit of Q&A as the panel progresses. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Feakin, and I'm sure we will get into those questions in the Q&A indeed. And now I would like to turn to Kerstin Vignard, who is leading the UN Institute for Disarmament Research support team to both groups, the UN Group of Governmental Experts and the new open-ended working group on cybersecurity. And she has also been leading UNIDIR, the team in support of the previous 4 GGEs. So clearly she has great experience in this regard. And so, Kerstin, over to you for initial remarks.
Thank you for giving me the floor and this opportunity to speak with all of you in this great panel that we have today. I guess it should come as no surprise due to that role that I've had in the GGEs, that I think that even now, while we're exploring new initiatives, new coalitions, new partnerships, like Toby mentioned, new multi-stakeholder arrangements, all states should recommit to the recommendations of the 2015 GGE report, which include the 11 norms of responsible state behavior. And I just want to do a little bit of myth busting, because I think there's a bit of confusion sometimes about the status of the GGE reports. So some people have heard that the GGE reports only contain recommendations. They're no better than suggestions. They really don't have any weight. So the fact that the GGEs are a longstanding mechanism. If you're not a UN junkie, these are not unique to ICTs. We established GGEs on a lot of different topics. It's true that the experts work by consensus and they deliver recommendations to the General Assembly. And via their consensus report, the group asks that member states actively consider, for example, the recommendations within the report and how they might be implemented. And for its part, the first committee of the General Assembly generally welcomes the GGE report or takes note of the GGE report and its recommendations. However, the GGE reports on international security. The 2015 report has a very particular status. The General Assembly, by consensus, not only welcomed the recommendations and the assessments that were in the 2015 report, but all member states agreed that they should be guided in their use of ICTs by the contents of the 2015 report. And that means that all member states have already voluntarily signed up to the 11 norms, as well as the affirmations first articulated in 2013 GGE report and then repeated in the 2015 report, that international law and the UN Charter in its entirety applies to cyberspace. And of course, 2015 also had practical recommendations on confidence building, capacity building, and international cooperation. So we talk about the 11 norms of the 2015 GGE. And while it's true that the GGE was the origin of these norms, they are actually the 11 voluntary norms of responsible state behavior of all 193 member states of the UN. And we shouldn't forget that. So to circle back to your question on what states can do to help ensure an open, secure, stable, accessible, peaceful ICT environment, and what they can do right now before waiting for these two processes, the GGE and the open-ended working group, to complete their work, what they can do is they can start by publicly reaffirming what each and every one of them agreed to in 2015 via resolution 7237. Thanks.
Thank you, Kerstin. And of course, as a public international lawyer, I cannot but agree. Being the chair, let's now turn to Eileen Donahoe, excuse me, who is Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University. But before that, she was a US Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council and then Director of Global Affairs at Human Rights Watch. So she's somebody who knows both the governmental and the civil society perspective. So over to you for some initial remarks.
Thank you so much for including me in this panel. I want to start with the point Ambassador Feakin made about the UN perhaps not being the most important venue at this moment for these conversations. And that pains me to say so, having been at the UN, at the Human Rights Council, in a very different time, sort of at the height of the internet freedom movement, when the sense was that the internet would serve as a vehicle for civil society, for the expansion of freedom of expression and human rights work around the world, which it has and it did. But we also now have become so much more sophisticated about the downside risks, which are gigantic and have basically overtaken our sense of what the internet is about. We are preoccupied with the downside risks, and have to say that is warranted because we now see, because of digitization of society, digitization of everything, we have systemic society-wide risks in every realm. And although we've been talking about the digital revolution, the digital transformation, disruption for over a decade, I think we are still barely getting our heads around the security vulnerabilities that have been created. So the second point I would make is I also would not say that the threat of malign actors is the one that I am most concerned about in the internet realm. what I think is the biggest threat at this moment to a peaceful internet is actually something Michael Chertoff started with, which is a breakdown of trust. And I would specifically say breakdown of trust in the democratic alliance between democratic governments. We no longer really have a shared vision of how the internet can be allow us to manifest our values. And I would even point specifically to the post-World War II liberal democratic order, and in particular, the international human rights law framework as our normative pillar for governance in society. We do not know how to apply that in the digital realm. And I think that what we've seen is governments are confused, but we are losing trust between democratic governments over how to govern the internet. And so I would put that at the top of the list in terms of job number one is for democratic governments to get together and re-articulate how we apply human rights values online. And that is liberty and security must both be protected. And at the same time, we must protect the integrity of elections. Those things must work together if we're going to have a democratic society. Last 2 points I would make. Obviously, the private sector is playing a much, much bigger role in providing both liberty in the ability to express ourselves, but also impacting security of citizens in ways never envisioned in the 20th century model. And so I would say the private sector needs to really step up to the plate and not only come to understand the value of privacy to everything, to liberty and security, but they need to exercise their own ability to embrace a commitment to democratic society. And I think they have much more leeway in doing that they have understood. They sort of have thought of themselves as technology companies, that they're not supposed to be in the norms business. And I think that's mistaken. They can choose the model of governance they want to protect, and they should do so more proactively. And the last piece is that security in digital society really starts with citizens and civil society. It starts with the protection of privacy for citizens because data is so essential to our identities at this juncture. And so we really have to have a conversation distributed throughout society about how to protect individuals and citizens at that level, at the grassroots level, as a very important part of this whole systemic society-wide conversation about a peaceful internet. And I will stop there.
Yes, thank you very much. And great talking points, which we will definitely turn to with trust in cyberspace. But also you mentioned the private sector. And now I would like to turn to representatives of the private sector. First to Liga Rozentale, who is Senior Director for European Governmental Affairs for Cybersecurity Policy and Security of Emerging Technologies at Microsoft. But before joining Microsoft, she was a Latvian diplomat, including with the Latvian delegation to the UN Open-Ended Working Group. And now Microsoft is very active in promoting peace in cyberspace and has proposed, for instance, a digital Geneva Convention during the Paris Peace Forum in 2018. I had the good fortune of listening to Brad Smith, Microsoft's president and chief legal officer, presenting this initiative at the Peace Palace in The Hague around the same time. It was very interesting and impressive. And so, Liga, over to you. What is Microsoft's perspective on ensuring a peaceful internet?
Thank you very much for having me here, and I'll be more than happy to give the impressions of Microsoft in this space. I was very happy to hear Eileen mention that industry should be in the business of norms. We're often criticized that we shouldn't be, so it's refreshing to hear such an invitation. And Microsoft certainly tries to put lots of effort in this space, as we are very concerned about our own responsibility for the technology that we provide. And the customers and all the global citizens in the world that do use this technology, especially now in a period of very high home working and much more digital contact. it was already mentioned that discussions at the UN are not the end-all of the norms discussion. And I would certainly say that while those discussions are very important and we appreciate that there are opportunities for multi-stakeholders to be involved in that process, and the UN has been very open to have input on the open-ended working group, we think that there is more that that can be done while these discussions are ongoing. As was already mentioned, 2 years ago at the Paris Peace Forum, there was President Macron announced the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which Microsoft has been an enthusiastic supporter of. And this is an initiative that has pointed out 9 different principles or challenges in cyberspace addressing norms precisely. But we think that this is a very important initiative while we wait for governments to try to reach consensus on some very difficult topics in state responsibility in cyberspace. But we think that there can be more action now and industry involvement. We always say multi-stakeholders, and one thing that has to be identified, each stakeholder has a different amount of resources and interests in this space, but trying to harness all of these stakeholders and finding ways to get the best out of everyone interested is a challenge that we look at through these 9 principles of the Paris Call. Building coalitions is very important so that in the absence of consensus, we can find those partners that truly are interested in contributing to different areas of responsibility in cyberspace to make action or projects that actually underscore not only the awareness necessary, but the actions needed to find conclusive results so that there's a sustainable effort made to be able to build the foundations of a society that follows norms throughout. So in raising awareness, we've had many different initiatives, whether it's the Digital Peace Now campaign, building the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, a coalition of more than 100 companies that puts cybersecurity as a highest priority, or the Paris Call itself. We focus a lot on the Paris Call because we find that it's a very good format in which to reach interested partners. And we've put a lot of effort into specifically looking at election security at Microsoft and working with the Alliance for Securing Democracies and the Canadian government to address all the issues in how we can bring about more responsibility in this space and preventing attacks on elections. But we can't stop only with one principle, and we're working to address different principles and with different partnerships, and really trying to look at the UN process as something that will provide opportunities and more visibility for capacity building. Capacity building, I think, has to also draw on various resources from different actors. So if industry wants to contribute, we also need those who want to receive services and assistance to reach out to us and let it be known that they would be open for capacity building, because it's one thing to provide assistance, but it also there has to be a recipient of the assistance, and that's not always evident as well. So I think I'll stop there with a short introduction. We've had a high level of experience of cooperation throughout COVID and applying all of our threat intelligence to see where we can thwart attacks and how we can build further coalitions to address cyber norms. But I'm very curious to hear questions from others and to be here to give more input, insights from industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for these initial comments. And so finally, let's turn to Julia Jasińska, who is Head of International Relations and Trade Policy at Nokia. Now, Nokia is, of course, one of the world's largest ICT producers, a technology giant with a big stake in the 5G market. And so, Julia, what is Nokia's perspective?
Thank you very much for having me today on this panel. Indeed, I will address how do we see our obligations as a technology vendor. And we think we have greater responsibilities given the outstanding position that we currently have, being the only Western company providing 5G end-to-end, having currently around 100 5G contract signs, and many of them resulted in live networks, so people can enjoy outstanding 5G, and we take responsibility for it. We also are leading on the telecom software market, which is not to be underestimated, given the importance of virtualization and cloudification in the 5G network architecture. So with all of that comes also great responsibility. So what do we do? Well, first of all, our primary goal is, of course, to provide best-in-class technology for our customers, and those are telecom operators, but also companies in many sectors nowadays, be it energy or transportation or even mining company, that will be using 5G, and through that going through the digital transformation. 5G is transformational because it allows, it will connect many physical assets, which has not happened before. So we'll be talking about the digitalization of energy, but also healthcare, transportation or production, digital manufacturing, which will be able to optimize performance and costs, something very important for the growth of our economies in post-pandemic times. But as the 5G becomes more and more indispensable for our economy and for our society, so is the price for those with malicious intentions to interfere with it, be it hackers or hostile agents of domestic or foreign origins. So as we design and later build, deploy, and have access to networks through the maintenance throughout their life cycle, we feel we need to deliver and provide a special trust, because our customers and the customers of our customers really expect that the companies with this privileged access to networks, like we have, would not exploit it in a malicious way. So we need to show that we take our responsibility seriously, and I think Nokia does it. Nokia has proved that honesty, integrity, and ethical conduct are really central to us. And this is not just because we are forced to it through regulation. This is not just to talk about it. We actually define, enforce, and report is important as well on all the processes which relate to that, on, for instance, our performance with regards to our code of conduct or our due diligence process when it comes to human rights. And it is transparent. Everyone can access the reports on the matter on the Nokia.com website. This transparency is important, and it pertains also to companies' transparent setup and ownership and business performance. And as a matter of fact, every quarter we publish results, the next ones in exactly 1 month on the 29th of October. So we provide a great visibility on the company conduct. Just like Microsoft, we've also supported Paris Call for Trust and Security, and the 9 principles of it, we believe, are very well integrated in our own company values, where we have a very holistic approach to security. I will not go through all the points here in the introductory remarks, but let me just say it's about how we deliver our products through design for security process, meaning that non-product will be released unless it is conform with all our special security checks that we have in the process. It is also about how we contribute in a collaborative spirit to improving security standards in standardization bodies, in, for instance, GSMA CCAC, which defined NESA's security assurance scheme, but also GSMA fraud and security group, or relevant 3GPP and ETSI standards. But let me say more. For me, peaceful internet is not just secure internet. This is also sustainable and inclusive internet. And in that respect, we take pride that we do not only take responsibility towards our shareholders or customers or employees. We also think about those who do not have access yet to internet, those who are left behind, because we have roughly 50% of global population is using internet, meaning every second person on the planet is deprived from the benefits of digitalization. And definitely something has to be done about it. And I must say, I'm proud that I'm working in the company where this is being taken seriously from the very top. And our CEO, Pekka Lundmark, has just 2 weeks ago been confirmed as a commissioner for the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. We also partner with WEF to work towards that, to make sure that no one is excluded. We limit our business when necessary, if, and this is back to the companies that take norms seriously. So we definitely prioritize norms and values. And if we would scope in the process of our human rights due diligence that our products may be misused and impact negatively human rights, in particular freedom of expression or right to privacy, we would not export it. Finally, responsibility towards the planet, and that would be the sustainable part of the internet. This is about making sure that the goods we deliver are done in the most respecting energy efficiency, trying to cut on carbon emissions, our own and those of our customers, and delivering on our pledge that we want to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees as compared to pre-industrial levels. So I will stop with this iteration of our activities right now, but I'm sure we will be able to go into details in a future discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to all panelists for those initial comments. And now after these first steps, I would like to dig in a little deeper. And I would like to start with a look at the institutional perspective, if you will, with the negotiations on responsible state behavior in cyberspace ongoing in both groups, the UNGGE and the OEWG. And obviously, with states being powerful actors that both shape the rules of the game, if you will, in cyberspace, but also conduct their own cyber operations, it is absolutely important to achieve a fundamental understanding on the peaceful use of cyberspace by those states. And so let me first ask Kerstin Vignard, who has led the UNIDIR's advisory team to the chairs of both groups for many years. Over the past decades of these discussions, where have you seen the most and the least progress in these processes? Kerstin, are you there? Okay.
You heard most and least, and that's all I heard.
Okay, sorry. Perhaps that was my internet connection. So no, the question was, given your experience with chairing or supporting the chairs of both groups, and you have been looking at the discussions in the GGE and the OEWG for many years, where have you seen the most and the least progress in these processes?
That's a great question. I think let me read. There's different things, a lot of directions. So first, it's exciting that multi-stakeholder is no longer up and until 2015 in the GGE processes. You could not smelter. You had a very limited number of traditional arms control and disarmament civil society organizations interested in the international peace and security dimension of these issues. You had obviously academic scholarship, but sometimes divorced from the actual political discussions. And you had some major companies like Microsoft saying, hey, we're interested in this and we have ideas and here are some ideas. Can we come talk? And never the twain should meet. I mean, the political conversation in the GGE was doing its own thing. And the attitude was that if you want multi-stakeholder, go see IGF. It's two doors down on the right. International security issues are here. It's the domain reserve of states, and we will keep it as a state-centric discussion. But following 2015, we saw a real growth in multi-stakeholder initiatives and processes on the international security dimension. And some of those were picking up on ideas that hadn't found consensus in the 2015 group. And then others, I think, were motivated by the failure of the 2016-2017 GGE to reach consensus. And that really accelerated different stakeholders starting to say, hey, we have something to add to this, and we want to move these issues forward in the absence of multilateral either dialogue or multilateral agreement. And so to bring in the technical community, the civil society groups, the more human rights perspectives, a really robust human rights conversation coming to the table, that really is a big change. So when I look back in 5 years, that's a big one. Secondly, we've seen content come back to the table on these international security discussions. You know, the very first GGE on ICT, so we're talking 2004, 2005, one of the reasons that it apparently failed to reach consensus is partially due to disagreements about whether or not content was an international security issue or not. And throughout the GGEs that I've been involved in, content has been raised in each and every one of them by a variety of states, and it's never found consensus. However, as we see digital technologies being used maliciously by a variety of actors for interference in internal affairs of states, including in elections, for misinformation and disinformation, to fan and spread extremist views, content has come back to the table as not just a national security issue, but an international security issue. I think the Christchurch call and the evolving stance of IT service providers on regulating or controlling content on their platforms, that all indicates that the international community is evolving its stance on how content impacts international peace and security. And lastly, and I think we've touched on it here, there's been an explosion of norms building initiatives. And I see this maybe as both a positive development and maybe one that can be less positive. On the state side, and I mean state-centric norms, we have the 11 norms of 2015. Are they, to quote Toby, the end-all be-all kind of thing? No, absolutely not. They are the floor, they are not the ceiling. And they are also state-centric. And we know that norms are equally important in other communities of practice and other stakeholder groups, and great work on norms building is being done there. But articulating norms or principles only gets us so far. Norms have to be observed, they have to be internalized, they have to be socialized. And there are many, many, many great common sense ideas for new norms, and they might just be too far away from state practice to be widely internalized and adopted. So even were they to be agreed, it would be in some bland, semi-ambiguous form of language. And ultimately, what matters isn't what we voluntarily agree on words. It's whether states' actions match those words and what happens when they don't. Thanks.
Thanks. So two great takeaways, multi-stakeholderism and content, to which I might return in the later discussion in the context of election security. But first, I would like to turn to Ambassador Feakin on the question of, his assessment of the work of the OEWG and the UNGGE. And of course, Australia is one of the staunchest upholders and promoters of the rules-based international order in cyberspace. And in fact, one of the stated goals of Australia's cyber engagement strategy, whose creation you have been leading and overseeing, is, and I quote, a stable and peaceful online environment. And to quote again from the strategy, to achieve this goal, Australia will set clear expectations for state behavior in cyberspace, implement practical confidence-building measures to prevent conflict, and deter and respond to unacceptable behavior in cyberspace. Now, based on this, end quote, based on this, what is your assessment of the ongoing discussions? Do we have enough clarity on the expectations for responsible state behavior in the forum? And do we have enough clarity on the responses to behavior which breaches these norms that have been agreed on?
Thanks for the question. Again, great questions. we're always heartening to hear that the strategy is still being read and referenced in the international domain. Something that we put at the heart of that strategy, if I could add to the quotes you've given, is the idea of transparency, and it's genuinely still heartening to, or not heartening. I mean, I wish more countries would follow suit, to be honest. But the fact that a 2017 strategy still says things around our approach to international law norms, and setting out expectations of what other countries and other stakeholders can expect from Australia, was at the heart of that strategy, and still beyond what I think many countries do. We still hold that dear in terms of everything we do, and all the position papers that you'll read from Australia are incredibly forward-leaning. We've pushed ourselves to do that. Whether it be normal implementation, whether it be providing case studies of how we would hypothetically interpret international law in certain instances. We're continuing to try and do that. Trying to provide a complete assessment of GGOEWG at this stage. Well, I won't try and do that complete assessment, but what I will say is that, I think we're on a positive trajectory with both of those processes. I think COVID has disrupted them a great deal, and that wouldn't surprise anyone. It's disrupted so much of what we do, and virtual meetings are fantastic for maintaining momentum, but I don't think the conclusion of these groups will be possible until they can again meet in person. You asked the question about should they be talking more about the responses. It's always been a case, as far as we're concerned, of getting more granularity on how international law applies below the level of armed conflict. Kerstin is a long time contributor to those processes, will know that's often the rub point where you start to begin to see divides in interpretations and concerns over where that takes us. And put simply, we feel that's important because, and this will lead into a lot of your later discussion around, election security and other issues. Because it provides more clarity around essentially what we're seeing go wrong in the international system right now, which is there are a set of countries, state actors who look to mercilessly exploit, if you like, the grey space, activities beneath the level of armed conflict that push up to that point but not beyond, and make it incredibly complex for countries to be able to respond to that. So, that's where you do see initiatives like the joint statement that my foreign minister made alongside the US and the Netherlands, which was, reinforcing that commitment to respond to malicious activity where we see it through a range of measures. As far as we're concerned, we do have a great basis already. There's been a lot of blood, sweat and tears shed to get to the point of having 11 agreed norms of behavior, to agree that international law applies in cyberspace. Yes, we need to interpret how the international law applies beneath the level of armed conflict, but there does need to be some kind of cost for those who, as Kerstin said, there's been a commitment by 193 countries to these pieces of work. So we need to ensure that there is more adherence to them. If I can just say one thing that's come through very clearly in this discussion so far, and it's been really heartening and interesting to hear the issue of values come through very clearly in a number of our speakers from Nokia, Microsoft, and from Eileen as well. Something I think increasingly we do need to be prepared to talk about is the values discussion in technology. And as you've noted, the previous international engagement strategy, we're currently developing an updated cyber and critical technology strategy here in Australia. And absolutely at the heart of that is around the values that we as a country want to see embodied in the technology space, because we're seeing that discussion rapidly accelerate across a range of technology areas, many of which are, if you like, feeding off the backbone of cyberspace, and will present us with very similar challenges. So, yes, I know we already have headaches around how we deal with the challenge in cyberspace, but this values-driven discussion on technology development and what norms and law look like in the new technology space that we're in already, I think is going to be pivotal in the months and years ahead.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned values, and I think I would like to refer back to what Eileen Donahoe has said, that one of the crucial values is to protect how our democracies work, how citizens' rights are protected online. And with upcoming elections in the US, but not only in the US, across the world, it is increasingly important to protect election security. And so my question to you, Eileen, is, would you say that the international community is doing enough in this respect, or what could be done more in order to protect this certainly very important achievement of our democracies?
So certainly I do not think we're doing enough, and it's actually quite terrifying to recognize the extent to which our elections are so vulnerable. Interestingly, as was already discussed, it's not so much to a traditional, cybersecurity issue. It's the content, the information as the weapon. And I will go further and say it's not only foreign malign actors reaching across borders with disinformation and information operations. It is the extent to which the quality of civic discourse around elections has deteriorated in our own democracies, and the role of domestic actors in that deterioration. That is, I think, one of the areas where the most work needs to be done. I just want to also point back, to this conversation about values in the tech realm. I absolutely agree. That is the crucial work that needs to be done. And when I think about the role of civil society, I think that's the sweet spot. I think civil society has the potential to be real thought leaders, helping governments and the private sector, as Ambassador Feakin said, get more granular and clear about how to apply international law in the cyber realm. And I would say it's not just international humanitarian law, it's international human rights law. This is what it has not been done at a real granular level. And it's all too abstract to just say we need to apply international law, humanitarian or human rights law, online as offline. It's like, what does that look like in practice? How do you simultaneously protect freedom, security, and democratic processes? That's actually the triangle of interest that democracies must figure out how to do simultaneously. How do we optimize for all three things? One of my concerns is I see democratic governments who are so concerned, justifiably, about the disruption of elections. They're regulating content online as though that's the solution. And I think it's actually very unfortunate, because often when you are criminalizing content or expanding the categories of speech that are not allowed online, you're actually throwing free expression commitments under the bus in the name of now election security, when that is not going to be the way that you actually combat the disinformation, whether it's domestic or foreign. And in that regard, I would say the moves towards transparency and accountability are much better approaches than the content-based approach. And then the other piece that I would add is the way that private sector companies can help. It's great to hear Nokia and Microsoft talk about the values realm as well. But given the extent to which companies are so integrated into every aspect of our societies, including the context of elections, I do think this idea of human rights impact assessments being embedded in the practices of companies becomes really important. And I think probably Microsoft and Nokia are probably the leaders in that space, thinking through not only in the design and development of products, but in the decisions about applications and deployment after the fact, after sale, thinking about how their own products and services are being used, and making sure that they are taking responsibility for the human rights impacts. And that can be with respect to citizens' privacy, users' privacy, citizens' liberty of free expression, but also in the context of affecting elections.
Okay, thank you very much. So you mentioned a couple of points involving the private sector, and so now let's turn to those representatives. One of the things that you mentioned is an abstractness or relative vagueness of norms, which needs to be translated into more concrete steps. And if we look at what Microsoft has been doing so far, for instance, they have proposed more concrete clauses that states should commit to, for instance, like refraining from inserting or requiring backdoors in mass market commercial technology products and so forth. And so, Liga, my question to you, do you think that states these clauses that you have been advocating for are reflected enough in the current work of the UNGGE and OEWG, or would you say that the international community still has to do more on that regard?
I think, first of all, Kerstin identified the progress of multi-stakeholder engagement quite well, that in the last 5 years, I would say that the voice that the private sector has or civil society has in this space has greatly increased. And that's only to the benefit, I think, of all parts of this discussion. I think it's essential that we also have a bit of humility when we come to this discussion. Microsoft has a very global reach and is in a position to advocate for a lot of the concerns of industry when it comes to software development, dual use capabilities, and working with states on these issues. So it's also important to have the kind of forums where more than just the largest voices of industry can be heard. And that's why we greatly appreciate that the UN process has included a large amount of stakeholders in the intersessional in December, but also that we can give more light to the concerns of smaller industry members through initiatives such as the Tech Accord or the Paris Call. I think there's issues that don't always go perfectly smoothly with government. The issues of backdoors is a highly contentious issue that needs constant dialogue and openness, especially in the context of current discussions on privacy and data localization. And those discussions will continue. We also recognize that as a global provider, we sometimes have to work with the rules in different areas of the world, and that requires a different form of cooperation. But I think that in general, coming back to the values discussion of the last question, is that we have put our values and respect for privacy and our customers as the paramount guidance for us in developing products. We've had lots of attention not only in cyberspace, but looking at artificial intelligence and the ethics behind development of artificial intelligence and how that needs to be communicated to governments, civil society, and specifically such parts of government such as law enforcement, so that these tools that we are providing are not misused in direct violation of human rights, precisely as mentioned before. But also working with governments, we have to go beyond just simple issues of development of new technology. We have to address more global problems such as climate or the UN high-level development goals and gender inequality issues, to see how we as technology providers can work best for governments to find solutions for more general problems, not just very specific technology problems, to create the kind of environment in which values are the standard for industry rather than something that puts us far above the rest.
Thank you, Liga. So on the question of values, and Eileen mentioned this human rights impact assessment, and I would like to turn to you there because this goes to something that you already said that Nokia is implementing. So how should such a human rights impact assessment of a company's production line or investment look like in your view?
Well, I can only share how we do it at Nokia. And I think every company will probably have to think internally what is the most beneficial way to implement that. But for us, we have voluntarily adopted a process in which we first screen, and we have like a list of red countries. Red countries meaning countries where that would be most prone to human rights abuses using technology. So if we see that there is a sale of a product which would concern specific country listed and which would concern a risky technology, we would run a proper process inside at Nokia with many parties involved and coordinated by actually a human rights officer, which we have at Nokia, to really evaluate whether there are risks and what is indeed the impact of misuse. And if we have no confidence that our technology will be used for a good purpose, there would be a stop to such a sale. So that's how we do it at Nokia. I know now that governments are also thinking about it and thinking about potential implementation of more legislative tools that would force companies in more broad way to have human rights reflected in their business strategies. For instance, in Europe, where I'm based, there are discussions about the human rights in export controls. We are still too early in the process to comment on which will be the final shape of this new legislation. But definitely we recognize that more and more countries are looking into that, and definitely companies like ours are willing to work to deliver in a best way on our values and on our human rights promise. Because I'm a believer in technology, and I think technology and 5G will do tremendous things to improve the way we live, to improve our standards of life. But indeed, there is a risk of misuse, so we need to take these risks very seriously.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to turn to some of the audience's question, and I would put it to the whole panel and who wants to go first. So Sven asks that we have been talking about norms, and there are plenty of norms and declarations and manifestos. But what if the adversary, state or non-state, doesn't value decency, truth, or trust in the rule of law? What do we do then? And who shall take the lead in responding to that? And this is a question to the whole panel. So who would like to address this?
I can jump in. No, go ahead, Ambassador.
Oh, no, sure. No, Eileen, please go ahead.
Let's start with the ambassador and then go to Eileen.
Yeah, we can tag. Yeah.
Okay, we'll tag team. No problem. I think that's a great question, Sven. It goes to the heart of the problem that we face, which is, whilst Kerstin said at the beginning, in the outset of our conversation, 193 countries, whether they choose to remember or otherwise, have agreed to the various UNGG reports. So yes, we have certain adversaries who don't really think too hard about whether they are actually breaking certain norms that they may or may not feel that they've agreed to. What do we do? Well, I think it's important that we don't always respond like for like, because that we still retain the integrity that we hold and to the agreements that we have. But that's why I spent a lot of time in the conversation that I've had is talking about consequence measures. We need to be thinking about how you change the way in which an adversary, the ease at which an adversary presumes they can break those rules and not have to adhere to those norms. So a lot of the conversation that I've been having in this discussion and elsewhere is about, well, how do you implement some kind of cost? How do you change that decision-making process? I think I'll hand over to Eileen now.
So I would add another. Yes, I would add another dimension to that, and it's really an excellent question. Even outside of the strict cybersecurity sense, how you get governments that don't agree with your values to adhere to those norms. I see this as moving in a very important geopolitical direction. The original concept of a global, open, interoperable internet is really what is at stake right now. And I'm sure you've all been privy to conversations about the splinter net and fragmentation. And to some extent, the open, interoperable internet is already gone. However, I do think there is the prospect of holding on to a democratic vision of what the internet should look like, where democratic governments band together based on their norms, and others will follow a different model. And in fact, we all know about the rise of digital authoritarianism, particularly the China model, which is role modeling, repressive use of digital technologies at home against citizens for censorship, surveillance, other forms of control and manipulation. Also exporting technologies of surveillance and infrastructure through which data can be sucked up for repressive purposes and in fact brought back to China. And then finally infiltrating that normative realm, international fora, where tech governance issues are being discussed and even tech standards for the future are being discussed. That's happening while the democratic world is kind of fighting with itself and fighting with the American and Western technology companies. We're missing the boat that this other model that absolutely does not respect our values is gaining traction globally. So I think it's very important that the Democratic Alliance get serious and understand we have to band together on a normative vision for democratic governance of digital society generally and utilization of technology by governments vis-a-vis citizens and use of data by companies. All of that has to be part of the vision. And the last thing I will say is that in order to really create a very strong alternative to digital authoritarianism, I would caution any democratically oriented governments from going too far in the direction of digital sovereignty. For me, that reinforces this more authoritarian vision of we can do whatever we want to do within our borders. The Chinese have talked about internet sovereignty for a long time, which essentially means you can't look at what we're doing inside our geographic boundaries and our now digital boundaries. And I think that democratic governments shouldn't be thinking of themselves as autonomous from each other. We really do need that alliance. And that's why, right back to the beginning, rebuilding trust around our shared values becomes sort of the name of the game.
Right, thank you. So we have time for one final question, and this one is from Daniel, who asks, do you think that the multi-stakeholder model lives up to expectation? And is it really putting actors on an equal footing, or is the debate still skewed in favor of be them public or private big players? So who wants to take this on?
I'll say a few words if I may.
Yes, Liga, please.
I think the multi-stakeholder model is an excellent way forward when talking about cybersecurity and a space in which the private sector holds most of the infrastructure that's being used or misused. I think one thing that I've learned while working in the private sector and specifically targeting initiatives that improve the multi-stakeholder model and a multi-stakeholder approach is that it's work that goes on under the radar. And it's very much work that does not get a lot of visibility, whether it's at conferences such as these, and it takes a lot of detailed individual work between stakeholders. And I think for that reason, it's the progress that takes place is not necessarily visible. I've mentioned the Paris Call several times. There are numerous projects undergoing and taking place under the umbrella of that, but not only that, but under the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise and various different other multi-stakeholder forums. At the IGF itself, you can encounter multiple projects that involve government, civil society, and industry. I think it doesn't get the awareness that it could. And that's one of the difficulties in seeing how it works, because when it comes to a high-level strategic discussions, it's mentioned in passing, but the details are something that go on every day and escape visibility.
Thank you. And Kerstin, since you have mentioned multi-stakeholderism at the UN OEWG, maybe you have a quick comment.
Certainly. I think it's been really great, both processes, not just the OEWG. We should remember that the DGE also, for the first time, also had consultations, regional consultations that were hosted by regional organizations, but there were often other stakeholders involved in those consultations as well. So both processes have had more input than ever before, which is great. The OEWG is particularly interesting in the fact that it's transparent, it's been webcast, its meetings, and then of course there was the informal multi-stakeholder dialogue. There's been obviously some hiccups along the way. There's issues about who gets to participate, ECOSOC accreditation, things like that. But we shouldn't forget that the OEWG will come to an end, right? I mean, negotiations will end, and it's not. There's some groups that are concerned that they are not able to participate in the negotiations, but they can, and then maybe not directly. These are state-centric negotiations, and that's just a fact, and we're there now, and hopefully maybe that'll change in the future. But what the negotiations we have now are state-centric, but you do participate. You influence individual governments. You influence other civil society groups. You create coalitions. You do things outside. I look at some of the norm proposals that were put on the table in the GGE that didn't find consensus, and then they were taken outside, and they gathered up a multi-stakeholder initiative that has taken those things forward, and that's exactly how this should happen. As we started this conversation, and I am a long-standing UN supporter, the UN isn't the end-all be-all here. It is part of the solution, but it is a state-centric organization, and there is so much more that is being done and that can still be done by so many other stakeholders that we should not put all of our hopes and also all of the pressure on the multilateral discussion. We can do so much more in so many other places.
Yeah, I think this is a great point to wrap up our discussion, as our time has unfortunately come to an end. A call to all stakeholders, let's get engaged and let's work together in multilateral and other fora to ensure a peaceful internet. So thank you to all of you who have been listening. Thank you to all the panelists who have been discussing, and I wish you all the best and good health to all of you in these difficult times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much too, especially for this crucial message of responsibility that at the same time was a very optimistic one, very proper for the end of the day.